Picture standing in a shadowy, ancient forest, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and burning oak. Torchlight flickers against towering, moss-covered stones as hooded figures chant in a language lost to the centuries. This wasn't some barbaric war dance. It was a ceremony of profound knowledge, a moment where the veil between worlds grew thin. For generations, we've been taught to see the Celtic tribes as little more than fierce, blue-painted warriors, a chaotic force that the mighty Roman legions eventually tamed. But what if that story, the one we all think we know, is only a fragment of the truth? What if the real story of the Celts is one of the greatest historical mysteries ever left untold? They were a people whose influence stretched from the windswept cliffs of Ireland deep into the heart of Anatolia, a civilization of incredible artistry, sophisticated law, and spiritual beliefs so deep they unnerved even their most powerful enemies. Their true legacy, however, was systematically dismantled, their history rewritten by the conquerors who sought to erase them from memory. Today, we're setting out on a journey to reclaim that lost world. We're going to pull back the curtain of time and venture beyond the battlefields to uncover the secrets they guarded so closely. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a detective story, an adventurous exploration into the heart of a culture that shaped ancient Europe in ways we are only beginning to understand. We've uncovered 25 hidden truths, from their advanced astronomical knowledge etched into the landscape to the real purpose of those haunting, intricate artifacts found in peat bogs. Each revelation peels back another layer, challenging our modern perceptions and revealing a people of stunning complexity and innovation. So, join us as we step into the mists to meet the Celts not as the warriors Rome described, but as they truly were, a brilliant, enigmatic, and deeply spiritual civilization whose hidden secrets are waiting at long last to be discovered. Our first hidden secret takes us from the torchlit groves to the cold, enduring surface of stone. Scattered across the landscapes of Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, standing like silent sentinels, are monoliths inscribed with a series of stark, straight lines. This is Ogham, often called the Celtic tree alphabet, and to the untrained eye, it looks less like writing and more like a series of tally marks or even a primitive barcode. But these simple lines represent one of the most enduring linguistic puzzles of the ancient world. Each grouping of lines crossing or resting against a central stem line corresponds to a sound in the early Irish language. The characters are named for trees like Beath for birch or Dure for oak, weaving the natural world directly into their very means of communication. For a long time, the common assumption was that these carvings were simple memorials, perhaps just stating the name of a local chieftain. But the truth appears to be far more complex and fascinating. These stones may have functioned as the official record keepers of their day. Think of them as ancient legal documents permanently etched into the landscape. They could have marked the boundaries of a family's land, a record of a significant inheritance, or the terms of a binding treaty between tribes. To carve a claim into a stone that would stand for generations was to make it unchangeable, a testament witnessed by the gods and the earth itself. There's also a compelling theory that Ogham held a deeper, esoteric purpose. Some inscriptions are found in hidden, secluded places deep inside coves or on isolated stretches of moorland locations that don't make sense for a public monument. This has led to the tantalizing idea that certain Ogham carvings were not for the eyes of men at all, but were instead incantations or magical formulae, a way for a druid to channel the power of the natural world they so revered. The origin of Ogham is itself a subject of fierce debate. Was it a brilliant, independent invention of the Celtic mind, a writing system born entirely from their unique worldview? Or was the concept of writing sparked by contact with the Roman Empire with its familiar Latin alphabet? The Celts saw the Romans writing, and rather than simply copy their letters, they may have been inspired to create a script that was utterly their own, a system of lines and notches that could be easily carved into wood and stone, and that reflected their own language and culture. It was a declaration of intellectual independence. To stand before an Ogham stone today is to be in the presence of a coded message from the past. With each stroke and notch, we get a glimpse into a world where law, magic, and identity were literally set in stone, a permanent whisper from a people who refused to be entirely silenced by time. But if the Ogham stones were the permanent public record of the Celts, our second secret takes us into the realm of the ephemeral and the fiercely guarded, the forbidden knowledge of the Druids. These were not merely priests chanting in groves, they were the absolute intellectual and spiritual elite of Celtic society, a class so powerful that they could halt a battle merely by stepping between two armies. For 20 years, a prospective Druid would commit their entire life to memory, learning an immense oral tradition of law, philosophy, medicine, and astronomy. They deliberately left no written records of their own, believing that true knowledge was a living thing, passed from master to student, too sacred and potent to be entrusted to inert parchment. This commitment to secrecy makes our understanding of them a reconstruction from the outside looking in, pieced together from the often biased accounts of their Roman enemies and the later Irish myths. The Romans, who documented their conquest so meticulously, wrote about the Druids with a mixture of awe and fear. Julius Caesar himself noted that they presided over all public and private sacrifices and acted as the ultimate judges in every dispute. Their rulings were absolute. To defy a Druid's judgment was to risk being excluded from sacrifice, a form of excommunication that cut a person off from the community and the favor of the gods. They were also the historians and genealogists, the keepers of the stories that defined a tribe's identity and its right to rule. A king's legitimacy depended on a Druid's ability to recite his ancestry back through countless generations. Imagine the mental capacity required to hold the entire legal code, historical record, and spiritual doctrine of a people entirely in your mind. This wasn't just rote memorization, it was the embodiment of a culture's collective consciousness. Their intellectual pursuits extended deep into the natural sciences. They were sophisticated astronomers, mapping the complex movements of the stars and planets and constructing elaborate calendars, like the famous Coligny Calendar, a fragmented bronze tablet that reveals a system of reconciling lunar and solar cycles with a precision that rivaled many contemporary civilizations. They used this knowledge not just for agriculture, but to mark the turning of the sacred year, the festivals of Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad, moments when the barrier between the human world and the other world was believed to be at its thinnest. This brings us to one of the most enigmatic aspects of their practice, the pursuit of prophecy through altered states of consciousness. Classical authors like Pliny the Elder describe elaborate rituals where Druids, clad in white robes, would harvest mistletoe from oak trees with a golden sickle, a plant they believed held the very soul of the tree. There are compelling theories that this was more than just symbolism. Mistletoe, along with other native plants like henbane or certain types of mushroom, possesses potent psychoactive properties. It is plausible that the Druids were skilled psychonauts, using carefully prepared and controlled substances to induce visionary trances. In these altered states, they sought to commune with the gods, receive messages from the ancestors, or glimpse the threads of fate. They were walking a very thin line between our world and what they perceived as the divine, all in an effort to guide their people. This is precisely why the Roman authorities, first under Augustus and then more brutally under Claudius, issued edicts to systematically eradicate the Druids. They understood that to conquer a people's land was one thing, but to conquer their spirit, you had to destroy their intellectual core. The Roman assault on the Druidic stronghold on the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, was described in gruesome detail by the historian Tacitus, who painted a picture of black-robed women screaming curses as Roman legionaries methodically cut down the sacred groves and slaughtered the Druids where they stood. It was a calculated act of cultural annihilation, which forces us to ask a haunting and ultimately unanswerable question: what truly died with the last Druid? What profound understandings of botany, what intricate philosophies about the nature of the soul, what songs that could chart the stars, what entire libraries of knowledge carried in a single human mind were extinguished forever in that final silence. The loss is immeasurable, and it leaves a ghostly echo in the history of the Celtic world, a void where a supreme intelligence once resided. Following the intellectual shadow of the Druids, we now confront one of the most chilling and controversial images ever associated with the Celtic world, an image burned into our collective imagination by their most formidable enemy. Julius Caesar, in his Gallic Wars, describes a ritual so terrifying it feels like something from a nightmare. He writes of a colossal effigy, a giant wicker man, its limbs woven from willow and its cavernous interior filled with living men, women, and animals. The Druids, he claims, would then set this towering structure ablaze, a roaring inferno offered as a sacrifice to their gods. It's a story that has fueled 1,000 horror stories, but how much of it is historical fact, and how much is deliberate Roman propaganda designed to paint the Celts as irredeemable barbarians, thus justifying their own brutal conquest? The truth is, as always, shrouded in the smoke of that distant fire. Caesar, a master of political spin, had a clear motive to exaggerate, portraying the Gauls as monstrous savages in need of Roman civilization and order was a powerful tool to secure more funding and political support back home. Yet, to dismiss the account entirely might also be an oversimplification. While archaeology has yet to unearth the charred remains of a giant wicker man, there is compelling evidence from other Celtic sites across Europe that points to the practice of human sacrifice under specific, extreme circumstances. In places like the sanctuary at Gournay-sur-Arronde in France, excavations have revealed the bones of both animals and humans, showing clear signs of ritualistic deposition. These weren't casual burials. The remains were often arranged in a specific manner, sometimes showing evidence of a violent death before being offered to the gods. This suggests that while the Wicker Man itself may have been a rare regional practice or even a Roman fabrication, the underlying principle of offering a human life to the divine was not entirely unknown. So, if such sacrifices did occur, what could possibly drive a society to such a desperate act? The answer likely lies at the intersection of profound faith and existential fear. For a people whose entire world was governed by a delicate balance with unpredictable natural and supernatural forces, a catastrophic event, a plague that wiped out livestock, a persistent drought that withered crops, or the impending invasion of a powerful enemy like Rome itself, could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. In their worldview, the gods demanded a payment in kind. To avert a greater catastrophe that threatened the entire tribe, the ultimate offering, a human life, might be seen as the only currency potent enough to restore cosmic balance. It was a transaction of terror, a desperate plea shouted into the storm. But there is another, more pragmatic layer to consider: the weaponization of terror. The psychological impact of such a spectacle cannot be overstated. Imagine the rumor of such a ritual spreading through a rival tribe, or more pointedly, among the ranks of an advancing Roman legion. The message was clear: these people are not just fierce warriors, they are so utterly devoted to their gods, so unshakable in their beliefs that they are capable of anything. This wasn't mere brutality, it was a form of psychological warfare designed to paralyze an enemy with dread before a single sword was ever drawn. The Wicker Man, whether real or a brilliantly exploited legend, served as the ultimate symbol of that fearsome resolve. It represented a line the Celts were willing to cross that their civilized adversaries were not, creating a terrifying asymmetry in the theater of war. After confronting the deep shadows of ritual and sacrifice, it's time to appreciate a different kind of Celtic brilliance, one carved not into stone or flesh but into bronze. In 1897, in a field near the French village of Coligny, archaeologists uncovered a puzzling collection of broken bronze fragments. Once painstakingly reassembled, they revealed a tablet covered in meticulously punched holes and inscriptions in Latin characters, spelling out words in the Gaulish language. This was the Coligny Calendar, and it is nothing short of a revolutionary artifact. Far from a simple farmer's almanac, it is a sophisticated lunisolar calendar, a complex mathematical machine designed to harmonize the inconsistent cycles of the moon with the steady journey of the sun around the Earth. This single object fundamentally shatters the simplistic Roman portrait of the Celt as an unthinking savage, revealing instead a society of keen astronomers and meticulous record keepers. The calendar spans 5 full years, each divided into 12 lunar months of either 29 or 30 days. But because 12 lunar months fall about 11 days short of a full solar year, the Celts faced the same problem that has challenged timekeepers for millennia. The seasons would slowly drift out of alignment with the months. Their ingenious solution was to insert an entire extra month every 2.5 years to resynchronize the whole system. This insertion wasn't random. It followed a precise, repeating 62-year cycle, a staggering feat of long-term celestial observation and calculation. To put this in perspective, the Coligny Calendar represents a system of timekeeping every bit as advanced as the one used by the Greeks or the Romans of the same period. It's a tangible declaration that the Celtic intellectual world was looking up at the same stars and grappling with the same cosmic questions as the celebrated philosophers of the Mediterranean. But the calendar's purpose went far beyond simply tracking time for planting crops. Each day on the tablet is marked with a single character, and this is where we glimpse the Celtic worldview in its full complexity. Certain days are annotated with the abbreviation MAT, short for good, while others are marked annum for not good. This was a spiritual and social roadmap. A good day might be the perfect time for a wedding, to inaugurate a new chieftain, or to begin a trading journey. An unlucky day, however, was a time for caution and restraint, a day when the tribe might avoid legal disputes or long travel, believing the cosmic energies were not in their favor. This blending of precise astronomy with spiritual belief shows a culture that saw no separation between the physical laws of the universe and the will of the gods. The turning of the year itself was marked by the great fire festivals we still recognize in fragments today. Samhain, which marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of the dark half of the year, Imbolc, the first stirrings of spring, Beltane, the festival of light and fertility, and Lugnasad, the celebration of the first harvest. These weren't just parties, they were critical pivot points in the cosmic and social order, moments when the calendar dictated a change in the rhythm of life for the entire community. The very existence of the Coligny Calendar forces us to reconsider the infrastructure of Celtic society. Creating and maintaining such a system required a dedicated class of observers, the Druids, to watch the skies for generations, to record the data, and to perform the complex calculations needed to project the calendar decades into the future. This wasn't the work of a primitive tribe, it was the work of a civilization. It demonstrates a profound desire to impose order on the chaos of nature, to find predictable patterns in the heavens, and to weave the daily life of the people into the grand, majestic tapestry of the cosmos itself. Now let's journey from the intricate bronze of the Coligny Calendar to a landscape transformed on a truly monumental scale. On the windswept coast of Brittany in France, there exists a site that defies easy explanation, the Carnac Stones. Here, across several square miles, stand not one or two, but thousands of prehistoric standing stones, arranged with breathtaking precision into long, parallel rows. We are talking about over 3,000 megaliths stretching for miles, like a vast, silent army forever frozen in formation. This is not a random collection of boulders. It is one of the most dense and complex megalithic sites anywhere on Earth, and its true purpose has been one of Europe's most captivating archaeological mysteries for centuries. To walk among these granite giants is to feel a profound sense of scale and intention, a project that would have required generations of coordinated labor, all dedicated to a goal we can only attempt to reconstruct. The first and perhaps most compelling theory is that Karnak was a gigantic, open-air astronomical observatory. Some researchers have noted that the primary alignments seem to target key solar and lunar events. For instance, the grand axis of the Manic alignments points toward the sunrise on the summer solstice, while other rows may have framed the extreme rising and setting points of the moon during its complex 18.6-year cycle. In this view, the stones were not just markers but permanent sightlines, a colossal calendar carved into the earth itself, allowing a class of astronomer priests, perhaps the predecessors of the Druids, to predict the turning of the seasons with uncanny accuracy and to maintain the sacred rhythm of the Celtic year. But astronomy is only one piece of the puzzle. Another powerful idea is that these parallel rows formed a sacred processional way, a kind of outdoor cathedral designed for ritual and ceremony. Imagine a solemn procession of robed figures winding their way through the narrow corridors of stone, moving from the smaller stones at one end toward the larger, more monumental groupings at the other. This physical journey could have represented a spiritual ascent, a movement from the profane world into an increasingly sacred space, perhaps culminating at a massive burial mound or a dolmen where rites for the ancestors were performed. The very act of walking this prescribed path, surrounded by the enduring presence of the stones, would have been a powerful sensory and religious experience, connecting the community to both the land and the divine. There are also more inventive, though still scientifically considered, theories. One fascinating proposal suggests the site functioned as an early seismic warning system. The theory posits that the stones were placed on sensitive geological fault lines, and that the carefully positioned menhirs would resonate or produce audible sounds in response to subtle tremors deep within the earth, long before humans could feel the quake. While this is difficult to prove, it speaks to the sophisticated understanding of the natural world that these ancient people may have possessed. Another symbolic interpretation views the entire arrangement as a massive representation of a deity, perhaps a mother goddess or an earth spirit, with the lines of stones charting the energy pathways or meridians of her body across the landscape. This transforms the site from a mere tool into an active object of worship, a divine map on a colossal scale. These scientific and symbolic theories, however, stand in stark contrast to the vibrant local legends that have grown around the stones. For over 1,000 years, a popular folktale has offered a much more narrative explanation. It claims that the stones are a Roman legion marching to attack a local Christian saint. As the soldiers advanced, the saint, with a mere wave of his hand, turned the entire army to stone where they stood. This legend is a beautiful example of how later cultures make sense of the inexplicable monuments of their predecessors, layering their own beliefs and historical conflicts onto a much older landscape. It served to Christianize a pagan site, to claim it for the new faith by explaining it as a miracle against the enemies of that faith. The enduring mystery of Karnak is that no single theory fully satisfies. It was likely a place of layered purpose where astronomy, religion, social ceremony, and territorial marking all coalesced. The immense effort required to erect these stones tells us one thing for certain. This was the absolute center of their world, a place where the cosmos, the divine, and human society met. It stands as a silent testament to the organizational power, the spiritual depth, and the sheer ambition of the prehistoric Celtic cultures of Brittany, a puzzle whose final piece may forever remain just out of reach. Moving from the silent, cosmic order of the Karnak stones, we must now confront a practice that seems to stand in stark opposition, a ritual of raw, personal violence that the classical world found utterly barbaric. Yet, for the Celts, headhunting was not mere savagery. It was a sacred act deeply woven into their spiritual understanding of the soul and the afterlife. Classical authors like the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus and the Roman poet Strabo wrote with a mixture of horror and fascination about Celtic warriors who would decapitate their most esteemed foes in battle, carefully preserving these heads and proudly displaying them as their most cherished possessions. To the Roman mind, this was the ultimate proof of Celtic barbarism, but to the warrior performing the act, it was a transaction of immense spiritual and social power. The core of this belief was a concept that resonates across many ancient cultures, that the human head was the sacred vessel of the soul, the very seat of a person's life force, wisdom, and unique identity. It wasn't just a part of the body, it was the essence of the person compressed into a single, powerful object. By taking an enemy's head, a warrior wasn't just killing him, he was actively capturing that enemy's strength, courage, and vital spirit, preventing it from being lost upon death, and most importantly, stopping the deceased's vengeful spirit from haunting him. The head became a captured asset, a reservoir of power that the victor could now claim and control. This belief transforms the act from simple trophy taking into a form of spiritual warfare. After a battle, the gruesome work of preservation began. The classical sources describe how the Celts would carefully clean the skull, often removing the brain and other tissues, and then treat it with cedar oil or other methods to prevent decay. This was not done carelessly, it was a meticulous process, a form of reverence for the power now contained within the object. These preserved heads were not hidden away in shame. They were displayed openly and prominently. Archaeologists have found architectural evidence from Celtic sanctuaries in southern Gaul, like the site at Intremont, where stone pillars are carved with niches clearly designed to hold human skulls. In a domestic setting, a warrior might hang the heads of his most formidable enemies from the doorway of his home or even from the harness of his chariot. This served multiple interconnected purposes. On one level, it was an undeniable public demonstration of his prowess and bravery, a resume written in the faces of his vanquished foes. But on a deeper, more potent level, these heads functioned as protective talismans. The very spirit that once sought to harm you was now trapped, forced to stand guard over your home and family, its power redirected to serve your own security. Imagine the psychological impact of approaching a chieftain's dwelling, only to be met by the sight of several decaying heads staring out from the porch, their captured souls now acting as eternal sentinels. This practice also found a place in formal religious life. At the ritual enclosure of Roquepetus in France, a carved stone portal, often called a skull portal, features niches that once held actual human skulls, likely those of particularly revered enemies or perhaps even ancestors. This suggests that the veneration of the head was integrated into their most sacred spaces, bridging the gap between the power taken in battle and the favor sought from the gods. The head was a conduit, an object that connected the world of the living with the world of the spirits. The prevalence of head imagery in Celtic art further underscores this obsession. Stone sculptures from the pre-Roman period often depict just the head, sometimes with exaggerated, otherworldly features like massive, almond-shaped eyes or a serene, knowing smile. These are not portraits in our sense, they are representations of the divine power inherent in the head itself, perhaps depicting a god or a deified ancestor. This artistic tradition shows that the physical act of headhunting was merely the most dramatic expression of a much broader and more profound cultural worldview, one that saw the human head not as a piece of flesh, but as the ultimate container of a person's eternal and transferable power. The idea of the Celts appearing as a fully formed culture in Central Europe has long puzzled historians, presenting an archaeological mystery that seems to defy a simple origin story. But what if the seeds of this civilization were not planted in the dark forests of the north, but much further south under the brilliant Mediterranean sun? This brings us to our seventh secret, a theory that connects the Celtic world to one of antiquity's most enigmatic lost kingdoms, Tartessos. Nestled in the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula, in what is now Andalusia in Spain, Tartessos was described by ancient Greek authors as a land of legendary wealth, a fabulously rich trading empire famous for its vast reserves of silver and gold. For centuries, it was considered little more than a myth, a sort of Atlantic El Dorado. But archaeological discoveries have since confirmed its historical reality, revealing a sophisticated, literate society that thrived from about the 9th to the 6th centuries before the Common Era, a period that intriguingly overlaps with the early emergence of Celtic culture in the archaeological record further north. The connection lies in a trail of scattered clues. Classical sources provide our first tantalizing hints. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, mentions Tartessos and even tells a story of a Greek sea captain named Kolayos who was blown off course and stumbled upon the kingdom, returning to Greece with a fortune in silver. More pointedly, later Roman geographers sometimes referred to the Celtici peoples living in western Iberia, explicitly linking them by name to the broader Celtic world. But it is the archaeological evidence that truly ignites the imagination. Excavations at Tartessian sites have uncovered artifacts that feel strikingly out of place for a presumed Mediterranean culture. Among the fine goldwork and Phoenician-influenced ivories, archaeologists have found distinctively Celtic-style objects, bronze cauldrons, horse gear, and weapons that bear a remarkable resemblance to those found in Celtic heartlands like Hallstatt in Austria. Most compellingly, at a site like Cancho Rono in Spain, scholars have uncovered a structure that some interpret as a possible nemeton, a Celtic sacred sanctuary or ritual enclosure. This is not merely a case of trade goods. It suggests the presence of people who practiced Celtic rituals and held Celtic beliefs, living on the very doorstep of the Tartessian kingdom. So, what are the possible scenarios that could explain this? One compelling theory posits that the Celts, or more precisely, the Proto-Celtic peoples, originally inhabited the Iberian Peninsula and were either a core component of the Tartessian civilization or lived in very close contact with it. In this view, the famed wealth of Tartessos derived from its metalworking could have funded a gradual migration northward. Groups of these people, possessing advanced metalworking skills and a complex social structure, may have traveled up the Atlantic coast or along river systems, eventually settling in Central Europe and bringing their culture with them. This would not have been a sudden invasion, but a slow, generations-long process of cultural seepage and settlement. Another, more dramatic, theory suggests that the collapse of Tartessos itself around the 6th century before the Common Era was the catalyst. The reasons for its decline are still debated. It could have been due to the overexploitation of its silver mines, political instability, or conflict with its trading partners, the Carthaginians. If a sophisticated, wealthy society suddenly disintegrates, its people scatter. It is entirely plausible that elite warrior or artisan classes from the fallen Tartessian kingdom, who already possessed a distinctly Celtic material culture, migrated en masse, carrying their technology, their art, and their social organization into new lands, effectively jump-starting the Latin cultural explosion that we recognize as the peak of Celtic civilization. This theory dramatically recontextualizes the entire Celtic narrative. Instead of a mysterious people emerging from the Central European wilderness, we might be looking at a diaspora from an advanced metallurgical society on the fringes of the Mediterranean world. It suggests that Celtic culture may have deeper, more southern roots than we ever imagined, with its origins intertwined with the rise and fall of a forgotten kingdom of silver and myth. The lost kingdom of Tartessos thus becomes a missing piece in the grand puzzle, a potential cradle for a civilization that would eventually paint itself blue and challenge the might of Rome. This mastery of metal was not confined to the spiritual and the ornamental. It was forged into the very instruments of war, and here the Celts held a technological advantage that could decide the fate of battles. While their Roman adversaries famously relied on the short, stabbing gladius designed for disciplined, close-order formations, the Celtic warrior wielded a radically different weapon, the long, slashing sword. Crafted from expertly smithed iron, these blades were not mere iron bars sharpened at the end. They were works of engineering, often over 70 centimeters long, with a flexible central core and hardened cutting edges, a differential tempering process that prevented the blade from snapping upon impact while maintaining a viciously sharp edge. This design was perfectly suited to the Celtic style of combat, which prized individual heroism and powerful, sweeping strikes, often delivered from the elevated platform of a chariot or horseback. A single, well-placed blow from such a sword could cleave through a shield, shatter a bone, or incapacitate an opponent with a single strike. The psychological impact of facing a line of warriors brandishing these gleaming, elongated blades cannot be overstated. It was the physical manifestation of a terrifying, unrestrained martial spirit. Yet, the true genius of Celtic military metallurgy is best exemplified by an invention so effective that their enemies would eventually abandon their own methods to adopt it: chainmail. The mail shirt, or lorica hamata as the Romans called it, was a Celtic innovation, a breathtakingly complex garment composed of tens of thousands of interlinked iron rings, each individually forged, punched, and riveted together to form a flexible, surprisingly protective metal fabric. Imagine the countless hours of labor required to produce just one of these shirts, a task demanding not just brute strength but a sophisticated understanding of geometry and metalwork. This was not the armor of the common foot soldier, but of the noble warrior elite, a symbol of status as much as a defense. Its brilliance lay in its perfect balance. It offered significant protection against slashing attacks while allowing for a freedom of movement that rigid bronze cuirasses could not match. The Romans, pragmatic as always, saw the superior utility of this technology and, after confronting it in battle, eventually equipped their own legions with mail, a silent but powerful tribute to Celtic ingenuity. This cycle of technological adoption points to a deeper truth. The relationship between the Celts and Romans was not a simple story of civilized versus barbarian, but a complex exchange where the so-called barbarians were often the innovators. From their revolutionary swords to their resilient chainmail, the Celts were solving practical problems of warfare with a creativity and skill that forced the greatest military power in the world to take note and imitate. Their metalworking prowess was, in essence, a form of silent diplomacy on the battlefield, a language of strength and sophistication written in iron and fire. Our ninth hidden secret shatters one of the most persistent stereotypes of the ancient world, the idea that the battlefield was an exclusively male domain. While the cultures of Greece and Rome largely confined women to the domestic sphere, the Celtic tribes nurtured a very different reality, one where women could not only own land and lead politically, but could also stand shoulder to shoulder with men as respected and often feared warriors. The most famous and visceral account comes from the Romans themselves, who faced the terrifying fury of Queen Boudica of the Iceni. When Roman authorities violated a treaty, publicly flogged her, and assaulted her daughters, Boudica did not retreat into mourning. She raised a massive army, and the historian Cassius Dio leaves no doubt about her martial role, describing her in the thick of the fighting. She charged the Romans in a chariot with her daughters beside her. He notes that she addressed her vast army before the battle, a role typically reserved for a supreme commander. This was not a queen watching from a safe distance. This was a military leader actively prosecuting a war of vengeance, and her presence on the front lines was a powerful symbol of righteous fury that galvanized her entire people. She was the rule, not the exception. Other historical records speak of Celtic women fighting so ferociously that they sometimes had to be separated from their male counterparts to prevent them from dominating the fight entirely. The Greek historian Plutarch wrote about how Celtic women would intervene in battles between their own men, stepping between combatants to stop the fighting, a role that demonstrates their recognized authority even in the most violent and chaotic of settings. But history books can be biased. Archaeology, however, offers undeniable physical proof. Across Europe, from the British Isles to the foothills of the Alps, burial mounds have been discovered that utterly Chinese letter, the traditional warrior narrative. These are not the graves of men, but of women, and their grave goods are the unmistakable accoutrements of a high-status warrior. In a spectacular burial at Wetwang Slack in East Yorkshire, England, archaeologists uncovered a woman buried with a complete chariot, a set of spears, and an ornate bronze mirror. This was the full kit of a Celtic noble, a person of immense social and military standing. Even more definitive is the discovery on the island of Bjørnshom in Denmark, where a woman was laid to rest with a magnificent sword in its scabbard, a shield, and a set of horse-riding gear. She was not buried as a chieftain's wife who enjoyed symbolic gifts. She was interred as a warrior in her own right, a person whose identity and social power were intrinsically linked to her martial prowess and her ability to lead and fight. These women were the Celtic equivalent of knights, a martial elite whose status was earned and displayed through their equipment and presumably their deeds. This martial reality was possible because of a social and legal framework that was stunningly progressive for its time. Celtic women enjoyed rights and privileges that would have been unthinkable for their counterparts in Athens or Rome. They could own, inherit, and dispose of property independently of their husbands. They could initiate divorce and, if they were the wronged party, take their property with them. They could become powerful rulers in their own name, like the legendary Queen Medb of Connacht in the Irish epic The Táin Bó Cúailnge, whose authority and ambition drive the entire narrative. Beyond politics and war, women held immense power in the spiritual and intellectual spheres. They could become Druids, the supreme arbiters of law and religion, or Fili, revered poets who held the power to satirize and shame even a king with their words. A king who lost the support of the poets could find his legitimacy crumbling overnight. This elevated status suggests a society that viewed women not as property, but as partners, vessels of unique power and wisdom essential to the tribe's spiritual and political balance. The Celtic world recognized a duality in the divine, where goddesses of sovereignty, war, and healing were as powerful and revered as their male counterparts. This spiritual landscape naturally translated into a social structure where women's potential was not artificially limited. To be a Celtic woman was to live in a world of far greater possibility and agency, a world where your voice could be heard in the council, your spirit could commune with the gods, and your hand could wield a sword to defend your home and your honor. This profound reverence for the severed head, so starkly demonstrated on the battlefield, found a more permanent and peaceful expression in the sacred art they left behind. Scattered across the former Celtic territories of Europe, from France to the Czech Republic, archaeologists have unearthed dozens of stone heads, carved with a powerful, abstract style that feels both ancient and eerily timeless. Perhaps the most famous of these is the Mške Jarovis head, discovered in a pit near a sanctuary in the modern-day Czech Republic. Carved from local limestone around the 2nd or 1st century before the Common Era, it is not a realistic portrait. Its face is a geometric composition, a stark, downward curving mustache, large circular eyes that seem to stare into another realm, and a hairstyle rendered as a series of precise, sculpted waves. It is a face stripped of individuality, representing not a person, but the very idea of the head's power. The fact that it was found carefully placed in a pit rather than shattered or discarded suggests it was the focus of veneration, perhaps ritually buried to honor it or to harness its protective power in the earth itself. These stone heads were not merely decorative, they were cult objects, physical anchors for the spiritual force the Celts believed resided within the human skull. They were placed at boundaries near sacred springs or at the entrances to enclosures, acting as eternal guardians, their silent gaze warding off malicious spirits and blessing the land. This artistic tradition seamlessly bridges the gap between the grisly practice of headhunting and the grand, sweeping narratives of Celtic mythology. Here, the legend of Bran the Blessed or Bendigeidfran from the Welsh collection of tales known as the Mabinogion provides a stunning mythological parallel. Bran was a giant, a king of Britain, who was mortally wounded in a catastrophic war with Ireland. With his dying breath, he gave his companions a solemn command. They were to cut off his head and carry it with them back to London. The tale then takes a remarkable turn. Bran's severed head did not decay. It remained alive, continuing to speak, to lead, and to entertain his followers with boundless wisdom and poetry for 87 years, a period described as a golden age of joy and feasting. The head was a talisman of protection and prosperity, ensuring the land was safe from invasion and hardship as long as it remained. Finally, when the companions, following a later command, buried the head in the White Hill of London facing France, it became a permanent guardian of the island, a spiritual bulwark against foreign enemies. This myth is not just a fantastical story, it is a profound theological statement. It codifies the core belief that the head was the seat of consciousness, soul, and charismatic authority, a power so potent it could transcend physical death itself. The talking head of Bran is the ultimate expression of this worldview, the captured power of a divine king used not for personal glory, but for the continued protection and nourishment of his entire people. When we place the stone head from Emshake Jarovis next to the legendary head of Bran, we see two sides of the same deep-seated conviction. One is a silent, stone representation of the divine power inherent in the head, used in local ritual and protection. The other is a grand national epic about that same power operating on a mythic scale. Together, they reveal a cosmology where the boundaries between life, death, and the spirit world were not solid walls but permeable membranes. The head was the ultimate conduit, a point of contact between these realms. In the hands of a warrior, it was a captured trophy of spiritual strength. Carved in stone, it was a fixed point of divine presence, and in the realm of myth, it was the undying conscience of a nation, forever watching over the land it loved. But this deep connection to the land, marked by stone heads and sacred enclosures, was paired with a profound belief in a world that existed just beyond the veil of ordinary perception, a realm of perfection that gave meaning to every aspect of Celtic life. This brings us to the ethereal concept of the otherworld, a dimension as real to them as the ground beneath their feet, yet accessible only through specific magical means. In Welsh mythology, this realm was known as Anon, the Not World, a place of untold abundance and flawless beauty, free from sickness, decay, or strife. Its ruler was Aron, a powerful and often enigmatic lord of the dead, who presided over a land of constant feasting and youthful joy. In the magnificent Irish tradition, the most famous iteration is Tir na an Og, the land of the young, an island far to the west across the sea where time stood still and sorrow was unknown. These were not grim underworlds of punishment and shadow like the Greek Hades. They were paradisiacal, parallel realities where the best of life was amplified into eternity. The Celts did not see death as a final, terrifying end, but as a transfer, a moving from one room to a brighter, more splendid one. This belief fundamentally shaped their famous fearlessness in battle. Why dread mortality when it was merely a passport to a land of everlasting feasts and adventure? Access to this wondrous realm was not a matter of simple travel. It required a breach in the fabric of the universe, and the Celts knew precisely where and when these thin places could be found. One of the most potent gateways was the ancient burial mound, known in Irish as a shea. These grassy, man-made hills were not simply tombs for forgotten chieftains. They were seen as the very dwellings of the gods and the ancestral spirits, the Tuatha De Danann, who had retreated into the hills and become the Ao-Shi, or people of the mound. To enter a Shia on the right night, particularly during the fire festivals of Samhain or Beltane when the boundaries between worlds dissolved, was to risk stepping directly into the halls of the other world. A person might be invited inside to feast for a single night, only to return and find that 100 years had passed in the mortal realm. Other passages were more fleeting and unpredictable. A sudden, dense bank of fog rolling in from the sea could transform a familiar coastline into the shoreline of Tir-Na and Og. A lone rider might follow a majestic white stag deep into a forest, only to have the trees shift and change around him, leading him into the golden groves of Anon. Even certain lakes and wells were believed to have portals at their bottom, leading to submerged cities of incredible splendor. This world view infused the entire landscape with a sense of latent magic and danger. Any turn in the path, any unexpected change in the weather, could be the prelude to an encounter with the divine. This belief was not just abstract mythology, it was the engine of some of the most enduring Celtic hero tales, providing a narrative framework for exploring themes of longing, loss, and the price of immortality. The story of Oisin and Niam of the Golden Hair is the quintessential example. The warrior Oisin, son of the legendary Fionn mac Cumhaill, is chosen by the beautiful otherworld woman Niam to be her husband in Tir-Na and Og. She arrives on a white horse and Oisin mounts behind her, riding across the waves to the land of the young. There, he experiences 300 years of endless joy, feasting, and adventure, all feeling like no more than 3 weeks. Yet, a homesickness for Ireland and his Fianna warrior band begins to gnaw at him. Niam, fearing for him, gives him a white horse to ride back but gives him one absolute command. He must not let his feet touch the soil of mortal Ireland. When he returns, he finds his father's fort in ruins and his comrades long dead. Coming across a group of men struggling to lift a massive stone, he leans from his saddle to help them with his great strength, but his girth strap breaks and he falls to the ground. The moment he touches the earth, the 300 years catch up with him in an instant, and he transforms from a youthful hero into a blind, withered old man. This poignant tale perfectly encapsulates the Celtic view. The otherworld offered perfection, but it came at the cost of one's place in the flowing, living story of their own people and land. It was a paradise, but also a kind of beautiful exile. This spiritual framework created a culture uniquely equipped to face the unknown. The knowledge that a better, brighter world existed just alongside their own, accessible through bravery, virtue, or simple chance, gave the Celts a profound resilience. It encouraged heroic action, as a glorious death was a direct ticket to the feasting halls of the gods. It softened the grief of losing loved ones, for they were not gone forever, but merely living in a different, happier part of creation. The world was not a barren, material place. It was a multi-layered reality, humming with spiritual energy and possibility. Every burial mound was a doorway, every misty dawn a potential veil, and every setting sun a path across the water to Tir-Na and Og. This was not escapism. It was a deep, integrated philosophy that allowed them to navigate the hardships of mortal life with a sense of wonder and an unwavering belief that the greatest adventures were always yet to come, waiting just on the other side of the visible world. Yet, even as they mapped the celestial patterns of Karnak, the Celts and their predecessors were engineering another, even more precise astronomical wonder that stands as a timeless testament to their genius. In the rolling green landscape of Ireland's Boyne Valley, a massive grass-covered mound rises from the earth. This is Newgrange, a passage tomb constructed over 5,000 years ago, making it older than both Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids of Egypt. To the casual observer, it appears as a large, rounded hill, but this is no natural formation. Its facade is a sweeping, retaining wall of brilliant white quartz stone, studded with granite cobbles, and it's encircled by a ring of immense standing stones, some of which are intricately carved with spirals, diamonds, and concentric circles, symbols whose meanings are lost to time. For centuries, it was simply known as a fairy mound or an ancient burial site, its true purpose obscured by legend. But in the 1960s, during a major archaeological excavation, Professor Michael J. O'Kelly made a discovery that would forever change our understanding of prehistoric Europe. He identified a unique feature above the entrance to the tomb, a small, purpose-built rooftop opening now known as the roof box. This was no accident of construction or later damage. It was a meticulously engineered light shaft, and it held a secret that lay dormant for millennia, waiting for one specific moment each year. That moment arrives at dawn on the winter solstice, the shortest and darkest day of the year. As the sun crests the horizon on that frigid December morning, something miraculous happens. A single, narrow beam of sunlight begins to penetrate the darkness of the 62-foot-long passageway. It streams through the roof box, a laser-straight shaft of golden light that cuts through the inner chamber's profound blackness. For approximately 17 precious minutes, this beam of light travels steadily across the floor, eventually illuminating the intricate spiral carvings deep within the central recess of the tomb. It is a breathtaking display of precision, a celestial alignment orchestrated by people who not only understood the solar cycle with incredible accuracy, but who also possessed the engineering prowess to literally capture a ray of the sun and direct it into the heart of their most sacred space. Consider the immense skill required to achieve this. The builders had to orient the entire massive structure to an exact astronomical bearing. They had to calculate the precise angle and height of the roof box to account for the sun's low trajectory in the winter sky. They had to construct a passage that was not only long but perfectly straight and level so that the beam would not be disrupted. This was a project that would have required generations of coordinated effort, a society organized enough to quarry, transport, and position 250,000 tons of stone, all to create a phenomenon that lasts for less than 20 minutes once a year. This was not architecture, it was a form of frozen music, a permanent hymn to the sun composed in earth and stone. So, what did this spectacular solar event mean to the people who built it? In a world without electric light, the encroaching darkness of winter was a time of genuine fear and uncertainty. The solstice marked the pivotal turning point, the moment when the sun's power was reborn and the days began to grow longer again. The illumination of the Newgrange chamber was far more than a clever astronomical trick. It was a powerful, multi-layered symbol of rebirth, hope, and the eternal cycle of life, death, and renewal. The light penetrating the dark chamber was a divine act of fertilization, the masculine sun god uniting with the feminine, womb-like earth of the tomb. This sacred union guaranteed the return of the sun's warmth and the subsequent rebirth of nature in the spring. It was a cosmic drama played out in microcosm within the mound, a ritual assurance that light would always triumph over darkness. This symbolism is deeply intertwined with the tomb's primary function as a resting place for the honored dead. The bones of the ancestors, likely chieftains or powerful elders, were placed inside the chamber, and the annual infusion of sunlight was seen as rekindling their spirits, charging them with the sun's life-giving energy. The ancestors were not gone, they were merely in another state, and this event was a direct communication with them, a way for the living to reaffirm their connection to those who had passed. The solstice light was a bridge between worlds, linking the living community outside with the spiritual power of their forebears within. It transformed Newgrange from a simple tomb into a vibrant, resonant engine of spiritual power, a place where the entire community's fate, their food, their survival, their very connection to the cosmos was symbolically secured for another year. To witness this event today is to be humbled not just by the technical achievement but by the profound, universal human yearning it represents, the hope that after the longest night the light will always return. Now let's journey from the celestial grandeur of Newgrange down to the very earth beneath our feet, to a landscape that seems utterly impassable, the great soggy bogs of Ireland. Here, hidden for centuries beneath the peat, lies our 13th secret, a testament to a different kind of genius, not astronomical but profoundly practical. We often picture ancient travel as following animal trails or simple dirt paths, but the Celts were engineers of their environment, and they undertook one of the most demanding infrastructure projects of the ancient world. They built roads not of stone like the Romans, but of wood, straight through the treacherous, waterlogged terrain of the bogs. These were the corduroy roads or trackways, and the most spectacular example ever discovered is the Coligny Trackway in County Longford, Ireland. Dating with incredible precision to the year 148 before the Common Era, this was not a simple path of laid-down branches. This was a massive, engineered oak road, a raised highway built to provide a dry, stable passage across a landscape that was otherwise a sucking, dangerous mire. Imagine the ambition to conquer a bog. These wetlands were formidable obstacles, hiding deep pools and unstable ground that could swallow a person or a cart whole. They were barriers to trade, communication, and the movement of armies. The Celts looked at this problem and devised a solution of staggering scale and complexity. The sheer logistics are mind-boggling. To build the Coligny Trackway, they first had to source the materials. This meant identifying and felling an estimated 300 to 400 massive, mature oak trees, some of them over 250 years old. Each of these giants had to be cut down using iron axes, then stripped of their branches. We are talking about trunks that were up to 6 meters long and weighed several tons each. Now the real challenge began: transportation. How do you move hundreds of multi-ton oak logs from the dry upland forests across the very bog you are trying to cross to the specific construction site? The prevailing theory is that this was done during the winter when the ground was frozen solid, or perhaps during a drier summer, allowing sledges or rollers to be used more effectively. It would have required a coordinated workforce of hundreds, if not thousands, of people, all pulling together in a feat of communal strength that rivals the building of the great tombs. Once on site, the construction began. The logs were split lengthwise, creating a flat surface on one side. These were then laid down side by side, flat side up, to create a walking surface that was over 3 meters wide in places, wide enough for 2 carts to pass. But they didn't just lay them on the soft peat. Beneath this surface, a foundation of round, runner-like logs was placed perpendicular to the road, distributing the weight and preventing the entire structure from slowly sinking into the bog. The finished road would have risen slightly above the water level, a solid, pale oak highway gleaming against the dark peat, a bold declaration of human will over a wild and unforgiving landscape. The purpose of such an immense undertaking speaks volumes about the society that built it. This was not a local footpath. A road of this scale and durability was clearly built for wheeled traffic, for heavy carts loaded with goods, for the movement of livestock to new pastures, and for the rapid transit of warriors and chariots. It connected territories, facilitating trade in essential resources like salt, polished stone axes, and luxury goods between tribes. It was a tangible expression of political power and social organization. A chieftain or a coalition of tribes who could marshal the labor and resources to build the Coligny Trackway were demonstrating their authority and their ability to improve the lives and economy of their people. This single road, preserved by the very bog that once threatened to consume it, forces us to completely rethink the Celtic world. It reveals a society that was not a scattered collection of isolated villages, but a networked civilization of coordinated communities, capable of planning, funding, and executing public works on a scale that would be impressive in any era. The silent, sunken oaks of Coligny are not just wood. They are the bones of a lost infrastructure, proving that the Celts were master builders not only of tombs for their dead, but of pathways for their living. From the grand, engineered oak roads that connected territories, let's turn to a different kind of import that traveled along those very routes, a luxury that became an obsession for the Celtic elite. Our 14th secret uncovers a taste that seems almost out of place in the hill forts of temperate Europe, a deep and abiding love for fine Greek wine. Far from being isolated barbarians content with their local brews, Celtic chieftains were connoisseurs of Mediterranean vintages, and the archaeological evidence for this trade is both overwhelming and incredibly telling. The most spectacular proof comes from the excavation of a Celtic princess's tomb at Vix, near the powerful hill fort of Mont-Lassois in eastern France. Dating to around 500 years before the Common Era, this burial chamber contained a breathtaking object that remains one of the most magnificent metalworks ever discovered from the ancient world. A colossal bronze wine-mixing vessel or crater standing over 1.5 meters tall. This was not a local imitation. It was a masterpiece of Greek craftsmanship capable of holding an astonishing 500 liters of wine. Buried alongside it was the complete set for an aristocratic Greek symposium or drinking party, finely crafted ceramic drinking cups known as Attic black figureware, a silver and gold dipper for serving the wine, and even a fine strainer to remove any impurities or herbs from the brew. The woman resting at the center of this opulence was adorned with a stunning gold torque, a symbol of her people, yet she was laid to rest with the definitive symbols of a foreign culture's most sophisticated social ritual. This single tomb speaks volumes. It tells us that the Celtic elite were not just receiving occasional trade goods, they were actively adopting and integrating the most refined aspects of Mediterranean culture into their very identity and ceremonies. The sheer scale of this demand is revealed not by single spectacular graves, but by the mountains of broken pottery found at major trading centers. At the Oppidum of Huenberg in southern Germany, another powerhouse of early Celtic society, archaeologists have unearthed fragments of thousands upon thousands of wine amphorae, the sturdy, two-handled ceramic jars used to transport wine and olive oil from Massalia, the Greek colony on the coast of modern-day Marseille. These were not small, personal shipments. We are talking about a constant, massive influx of these containers, suggesting that wine drinking was not a rare privilege but a regular, integral part of elite life. The trade route itself was a marvel of ancient logistics. It began in the vineyards of Greece and Italy, where wine was poured into amphorae and stamped with the mark of its producer. From there, it was shipped across the Mediterranean to Massalia. Then began the most difficult leg of the journey, the slow, arduous transport up the Rhone River, a vital artery cutting deep into the heart of the continent. From the Rhone, goods were portaged overland to the headwaters of the Seine, the Loire, and the Danube, where they could be distributed by boat and cart to the hill forts of Germany, Switzerland, and beyond. This was a network spanning over 1,000 kilometers, connecting the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean directly to the chieftains' halls of what the Greeks and Romans dismissively called barbarian Europe. It was a conduit for more than just wine. Olive oil, fine black-glazed pottery, and bronze vessels traveled north, while raw materials crucial to the Mediterranean economies, gold, tin, amber, and most importantly, slaves, traveled south. This system transformed the Celtic world, pulling it into a vast economic and cultural sphere, and bringing with it not just goods, but revolutionary ideas about art, status, and power. This imported luxury, however, was a double-edged sword, a sweet poison that began to corrode the very foundations of traditional Celtic society. In the old warrior-based hierarchy, status was earned and displayed through martial prowess, personal charisma, and the distribution of cattle, land, and finely crafted local goods like torques and weapons. A chieftain proved his worth by his bravery in battle and his generosity to his followers. The new economy of prestige, fueled by Mediterranean wine, introduced a radically different dynamic. Now, a leader's power was increasingly measured by his ability to control the flow of these exotic imports. The wine symposium became the new stage for political negotiation and social climbing. To be a generous host, a chieftain needed a constant, expensive supply of wine. This created an intense, zero-sum competition among the elite. They had to produce more and more of the raw materials the Mediterranean world desired in order to acquire the wine that cemented their local authority. This likely intensified slave raiding and warfare between tribes, not for territory or honor alone, but to capture human capital to trade for the next shipment of amphorae. The social effects were profound. The new wine-drinking ritual, centered on couches and imported ceramics, created a cultural gulf between the elite who could participate in this sophisticated practice and the common warriors who were excluded. The old bonds of shared mead drinking in a great hall were strained, replaced by a new, exclusive form of social power that was dependent on a foreign supply chain. The Celtic world was becoming hooked on a vice it could not produce itself, creating a structural vulnerability. The Romans, ever the astute observers and strategists, saw this dependency with perfect clarity. When Julius Caesar began his conquest of Gaul, he didn't just bring legions, he brought merchants. He understood that the promise of continued access to wine and other Roman luxuries could be used to bribe, divide, and pacify the Celtic tribes. By controlling the source of the very commodity that had become a symbol of elite status, Rome could effectively turn the Celtic love for wine into a powerful weapon of subjugation. The same trade networks that had once brought sophistication and connectivity now became a leash, and the Roman hand was all too ready to take hold of it. And that brings us to one of the most visually stunning and perplexing artifacts ever pulled from the earth, the Gundestrup cauldron. Discovered in a peat bog in Denmark in 1891, this magnificent vessel is a masterpiece of ancient silverwork, yet it poses a mystery that has captivated archaeologists for over a century. It is a large, circular bowl made of solid silver, constructed from 13 separate panels, 1 base and 12 side plates, all richly decorated with intricate repoussé designs depicting gods, goddesses, warriors, and a menagerie of mythical creatures. The sheer artistry is breathtaking, but the secret of the Gundestrup cauldron is not just in its beautiful imagery. It lies in its bewildering origin story and the long, silent journey it must have taken before being carefully taken apart and offered to the bog. Stylistically, the cauldron is a cultural chimera. Some elements are unmistakably Celtic. Most notably, one panel features a serene, cross-legged male figure holding a torque in one hand and a ram-horned serpent in the other. This is almost certainly one of the earliest known depictions of Cernunnos, the Celtic lord of the animals, the forest, and perhaps even the gateway to the other world. His presence anchors the object firmly within the Celtic spiritual universe. Yet, the techniques used to create it, the specific way the silver was worked, the style of the human faces with their large, sorrowful eyes, and the decorative motifs of rosettes and pomettes all point strongly to the Thracian world, a powerful kingdom located in what is now Bulgaria and Romania. The Thracians were renowned for their metalwork, and it seems this incredible object was likely crafted in a Thracian workshop, perhaps commissioned by a Celtic chieftain or even made for a Thracian patron with knowledge of Celtic beliefs. This creates a fascinating puzzle, a vessel brimming with Celtic iconography crafted with Thracian skill and found dismantled in a Danish bog. So how did it get there? The most plausible theory involves the Great Migration of the Cimbri and Teutones tribes, a massive movement of people from the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark who swept south into Roman territories in the 2nd century before the Common Era. On their long and violent journey, they would have passed through or raided territories where such a magnificent object could have been plundered as spoils of war. A sacred cauldron used in Thracian or Celtic rituals would have been a prize of unimaginable value, both for its material worth and for the spiritual power it was believed to contain. It may have changed hands multiple times, a treasured spoil passed from tribe to tribe as it traveled northward, until it finally came into the possession of the people who carried it back to its final resting place in Denmark. But why would they then take it apart and deliberately deposit it in a bog? This act was almost certainly not an act of discard, but one of profound reverence. We know from countless other finds that bogs were seen as liminal spaces, gateways to the gods. To offer something as precious as the Gundestrup cauldron to the waters was the ultimate sacrifice, a way to commune with the divine and secure favor, perhaps in thanks for a safe return from a long journey or as a plea for protection in turbulent times. Dismantling it might have been a ritual killing of the object, releasing its spirit to the other side, or a practical way for a community to each contribute a piece of the sacrifice. When we look closely at the panels, we are essentially reading a complex mythological storybook. Beyond Cernunnos, we see a powerful female figure flanked by wheels, likely a goddess of sovereignty or the land. Another panel shows a line of warriors with Celtic-style shields and cornixes, those terrifying, boar-headed war trumpets marching alongside a giant figure who is dunking a smaller man into a barrel. This could represent a ritual of initiation or rebirth. One of the most striking images is of a bull-slaying scene, with dogs and a figure wielding a sword, which echoes themes of sacrifice and regeneration found across the ancient world. The Gundestrup cauldron, therefore, is more than a beautiful bowl. It is a physical record of long-distance connections of art, ideas, and beliefs flowing across a continent. It represents a moment when Celtic mythology was translated into Thracian silver and then carried across Europe to be given back to the earth in a final, sacred transaction. It is a silent witness to the vast, interconnected, and spiritually charged world of ancient Europe, a world where a single object could embody the beliefs of multiple cultures and journey hundreds of miles to fulfill its ultimate divine purpose. But what if one of the most famous stories in the entire Western world, the legend of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, is itself one of the greatest hidden Celtic secrets? The polished, chivalric tales of knights in shining armor, courtly love, and the quest for the Holy Grail that we know today are largely the product of the French Middle Ages. Yet, if we peel back these later layers of romance and Christian symbolism, we find a much older, wilder, and distinctly Celtic heart beating at the center of the myth. The very first literary mentions of Arthur are not in Latin chronicles, but in cryptic Welsh poems like the Gododdin, where a warrior's bravery is measured against that of a figure named Arthur, implying he was already a legendary standard of martial prowess. This early Arthur is not a crowned king residing in a grand castle like Camelot. He is a war leader, a dux bellorum, a defender of Britain in the chaotic period after the Roman legions withdrew, fighting not just Saxon invaders but all manner of supernatural threats. He is surrounded not by French-speaking knights, but by a band of heroes with names straight from Celtic mythology. Kai, who could hold his breath for 9 days and generate supernatural heat, and Bedwyr, the one-handed warrior of incredible speed. This original Arthurian world is one of magic, shape-shifting, and direct encounters with the otherworld, a far cry from the orderly feudal court we often imagine. The location of his final rest, the Isle of Avalon, is itself a direct lift from the Celtic otherworld, a mystical island of apple trees ruled by powerful sorceresses, much like Tyr na and Og. And just as Arthur has his roots in an earlier defender, the figure of Merlin, the wise old wizard, undergoes an even more dramatic transformation from his Celtic origins. The courtly advisor of later legend bears little resemblance to his true prototype, Myrddin Wyllt, a wild man of the Welsh forest. In poems like the Afollinau and the Hoyonau, Myrddin is not a calm, bearded sage in a star-spangled robe. He is a madman driven to insanity after witnessing the horrific slaughter of a battle. He flees into the Caledonian forest, living like an animal among the wolves and deer, consuming roots and berries and screaming prophecies from the tangled groves. His magic is not learned from books, but flows from his raw, unmediated connection to the natural world. He speaks with the animals and the wind, and his fits of prophetic insight come from this state of divine madness, a concept deeply resonant with the Celtic archetype of the shaman or the ecstatic poet. This wild man, this prophet of the woods, was later cleaned up, Christianized, and inserted into the Arthurian story by chroniclers like Geoffrey of Monmouth, who Latinized Myrddin to Merlinus and gave him a new, more palatable backstory. But his core power, the ability to see the future, remains a direct inheritance from the untamed prophetic spirit of Myrddin Wyllt, a figure who embodies the Celtic belief that true wisdom could be found not in castles, but in the deepest, most chaotic heart of the wild. Perhaps the most profound Celtic secret embedded in the Arthurian cycle, however, concerns the ultimate object of the quest itself, the Holy Grail. In the later medieval romances, it is the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, a profoundly Christian relic embodying divine grace. But its literary and symbolic antecedents are almost certainly older, pointing directly back to the magical cauldrons of Celtic mythology. In the early Welsh tale Peredur, son of Efrog, a precursor to the Grail romances, the hero witnesses a mysterious procession featuring a bleeding lance and a magnificent platter carrying a man's severed head. While not a cup, the scene is drenched in Celtic ritual and symbolism. More explicitly, in the story of Branwen Fyrch Llŷr from the Mabinogion, we encounter the Cauldron of Rebirth. This magical vessel, given to the Welsh king Bran by a giant, possesses the power to resurrect dead warriors. They are placed in the cauldron and emerge the next day, fully alive and ready to fight, though they have lost the power of speech. This is not a relic of passive contemplation. It is an active, regenerative tool of immense power, a direct parallel to the life-sustaining properties later attributed to the Grail. The evolution from this pagan cauldron of plenty and rebirth to the Christian chalice is a fascinating process of cultural absorption. The early Celtic Christians, whose spirituality was deeply infused with the imagery of their ancestral beliefs, would have found it natural to map the powerful symbolism of their own magical vessel, a source of endless nourishment, healing, and life, onto the most sacred vessel of their new faith. The Grail, like the cauldron, becomes an object of a perilous quest, guarded by a wounded king in a blighted land, and its recovery brings healing and restoration to the wasted kingdom, a theme that echoes the Celtic understanding of the ruler's health being directly tied to the fertility of the land. So, the next time you picture the quest for the Holy Grail, remember that the knights in shining armor may be chasing a vision that began not in the Holy Land, but in the misty, magical otherworld of the ancient Celts, a world where a cauldron could bring the dead back to life and a king's wound could wither an entire nation. From the mythic cauldrons of legend, we now turn to a far more visceral and tangible mystery, one that has emerged from the cold, dark earth to confront us with haunting, silent questions. Across the wetlands of northern Europe, particularly in Ireland, the United Kingdom, and Denmark, peat cutters have for centuries made a series of chilling discoveries. They are the bog bodies, men, women, and even teenagers, their features preserved with eerie clarity by the unique chemistry of the peat. The acidic, cold, and oxygen-poor environment of the bog tans the skin to dark leather, pickles the internal organs, and often leaves the face so intact that you can still see the stubble on a man's chin or the lines on his forehead. These are not skeletons from which we must reconstruct a life. These are individuals frozen in a moment of violent death, offering us an unparalleled and deeply personal window into the final moments of a Celtic-era person. Perhaps the two most famous of these are Tollund Man from Denmark and Lindo Man from England. Tollund Man, with his gentle, sleeping expression and a noose still visible around his neck, was so well preserved that when he was discovered in 1950, the finders believed they had stumbled upon a recent murder victim. Lindo Man, found in a peat bog in Cheshire in 1984, presented an even more complex and brutal picture. Scientific analysis revealed that he was a healthy man in his mid-20s with well-groomed hands and a last meal of charred bread. His death, however, was anything but gentle. He was the victim of what archaeologists have termed a triple death. First, he was struck savagely on the top of his head with a heavy, blunt object, which likely stunned him and fractured his skull. Then, a thin, sinew cord was twisted around his neck, tightening like a garrote to strangle him and break his neck. Finally, and perhaps most symbolically, his throat was cut in a single, deep slash, presumably to drain his blood. This was not a simple killing. It was a ritualized, multi-stage execution that speaks to a profound and deeply ingrained set of beliefs. The central and deeply unsettling question is, why would a community subject one of its own to such an elaborate and violent end? The evidence points overwhelmingly towards a ritualistic purpose rather than a common criminal execution. The state of the bodies themselves provides the first clue. These are not people who were carelessly dumped. Lindo Man's hands showed no signs of the hard labor typical of a slave. His well-manicured nails suggest a person of some status. Toland Man's last meal was a simple, gruel-like porridge, but one that contained a wide variety of seeds and grains, some of which may have had symbolic or even mildly psychoactive properties, possibly consumed as part of a final ritual meal. Furthermore, the triple death method itself is incredibly rare in the context of standard punishments. It seems unnecessarily complex if the sole goal was simply to kill. Instead, many scholars argue that this layered form of killing was designed to appease multiple deities or to address different aspects of the cosmos. The blow to the head might have been an offering to a god of the sky or intellect, the strangulation a sacrifice to a god of the earth or fertility, and the throat-cutting and bloodletting a libation to a chthonic or underworld deity associated with water and the bog itself. The bog was not a random dumping ground. It was a liminal space, a boundary between the world of the living and the other world. To place a sacrifice in the bog was to deliver it directly into the hands of the gods, a permanent offering that would slowly be accepted by the peat, locking the victim and the act of sacrifice into the landscape for eternity. There are, of course, other compelling interpretations. One theory posits that these individuals were not willing sacrifices, but criminals or social outcasts who had committed a terrible taboo. In early Irish law texts, there are references to the concept of a kinslaying, the murder of a relative, being one of the few crimes considered so heinous that the perpetrator could be offered as a sacrifice to the gods, a kind of divine justice that also served to purify the community from the spiritual pollution of the act. The triple death could then be seen as a punishment that fit the crime, an expulsion of a polluted individual in a way that also served a protective, apotropaic function for the tribe. Another, even more dramatic, theory suggests that some of these bog bodies, particularly those of young, healthy men like Lindo Man, could have been deposed kings or failed chieftains. In the Celtic world, the health and prosperity of the tribe were believed to be directly tied to the physical vigor and sacred legitimacy of its ruler. If a king grew old, ill, or weak, or if the land suffered from famine or invasion, it could be interpreted as a sign that his sacred contract with the goddess of the land had broken. In such a case, the king would need to be ritually sacrificed to ensure the land's fertility and the tribe's survival for another reign. This connects the bog bodies directly to the mythological themes of the wounded king and the wasted land that we later see in the Grail legends, suggesting a very real, very brutal historical practice behind the myth. Ultimately, the truth likely lies in a combination of these ideas. The bog bodies represent a profound and complex interaction between religion, law, and political power. They were individuals chosen for a specific, terrifying purpose. Whether they were willing volunteers, believing their death would secure divine favor for their people, or unwilling victims, criminals or fallen leaders being scapegoated for the good of the many, we will never know for certain. What we are left with is their silent, powerful presence. To stand before the remains of Lindo Man or to look into the peaceful face of Toland Man, is to be confronted with the stark reality of a belief system so powerful, so visceral, that it demanded the ultimate price. They are not merely archaeological specimens, they are a direct, haunting connection to the Celtic soul, a reminder that their world was one where the boundaries between life and death, the human and the divine, were negotiated in the most dramatic and permanent of ways, sealed forever in the quiet, accepting darkness of the bog. Yet, if the bog bodies reveal a culture willing to make the most personal of offerings to the divine, our 18th secret shows us how they also captured the vast and intricate nature of the cosmos itself in the breathtaking beauty of their artwork. You have undoubtedly seen it, the mesmerizing, endlessly looping patterns of Celtic knotwork, adorning everything from ancient stone crosses to the pages of modern-day tattoos. For centuries, these intricate designs were admired for their sheer visual complexity, but we now understand they were far more than simple decoration. They were a sophisticated symbolic language, a secret code woven into the very fabric of their art that expressed the deepest truths of the Celtic worldview. The most fundamental principle encoded in these knots is their lack of a beginning or an end. A single, unbroken line wins its way across the design, weaving over and under itself in an eternal dance. This was not an artistic whim. It was a direct visual representation of their belief in the cyclical nature of all existence, the endless loop of life, death, and rebirth, the perpetual turning of the seasons, and the timeless, infinite nature of the soul. Just as the year moved from Samhain to Beltane and back again without ever truly stopping, the knotwork mirrored this cosmic cycle, suggesting that the path of the spirit was not a linear journey to a final destination, but an ongoing, interconnected process. This idea of interconnection is another vital key to deciphering the code. In a complex knot, you cannot pull a single strand without affecting the entire design. Every loop and crossing is dependent on the others. This beautifully illustrates the Celtic understanding that all things in the universe were linked. The gods and the mortal world, the living and the ancestors, humanity and the natural environment. A chieftain's health was tied to the land's fertility. A warrior's bravery was connected to the honor of his tribe, and the flight of a bird could carry a message from the other world. The knot was a map of this sacred web of life, a reminder that no person, no creature, and no event existed in true isolation. Beyond these philosophical concepts, this interlacing art served a powerful and very practical spiritual function: protection. The sheer complexity of the patterns was believed to be spiritually potent. Evil spirits, often thought to be simplistic and easily confused, were said to become trapped and mesmerized by the endless, pathless designs. A spirit trying to follow a single line would find itself led in circles, forever unable to find a way in or a way out, thus rendering the object or person adorned with the knot safe from harm. This is why we so often find these intricate patterns on weapons, shields, and horse harnesses, the very items a warrior would rely on for survival in battle, a realm fraught with both physical and supernatural danger. Jewelry, especially brooches and torques, frequently featured these designs, creating a permanent, personal barrier of spiritual protection for the wearer. The knot was a kind of permanent, woven spell, a silent guardian etched into metal or stone. This apotropaic or evil-averting power was so deeply ingrained in the culture that it survived one of the greatest cultural shifts in European history, the coming of Christianity. When Irish monks in remote monasteries like Iona and Lindisfarne began to create their magnificent illuminated manuscripts such as the Book of Kells, they faced a fascinating artistic and theological challenge. They were dedicated to spreading the word of a new, monotheistic faith, yet they were surrounded by a rich, vibrant artistic tradition that was undeniably pagan in its origins. Rather than reject this native art form, they performed a remarkable act of cultural synthesis. They adopted the intricate knotwork, the spirals, and the zoomorphic animal form, patterns of their ancestors, and baptized them into a new Christian context. The endless knot, which once symbolized the cyclical Celtic soul, was reinterpreted to represent the eternal and unending love of God, or the interconnected nature of the Holy Trinity. The terrifying, protective beasts that once warded off evil spirits were transformed into symbols of the evangelists, or playful, holy creatures inhabiting the margins of the sacred text. The monks were essentially using a visual language that their own people already understood to be powerful and sacred to illuminate a new sacred story. The process of creating these manuscripts was itself a spiritual discipline, a form of meditation. A single monk might spend weeks on a single capital letter, his pen meticulously tracing the impossibly complex paths of the knotwork. This intense focus was a physical prayer, a way of losing oneself in the divine pattern, mirroring the eternal, interconnected reality the art represented. The result is some of the most stunning art ever produced, a perfect fusion where the old magic of the Celts was harnessed to glorify the new god, proving that the symbolic power of the knot was so profound it could bridge the gap between two seemingly opposed worlds, weaving them together into a single, magnificent tapestry of faith. As we move from the cosmic patterns of their art to the most basic routines of daily life, we uncover a secret so mundane, so utterly practical, that it perfectly illustrates the ingenious and often paradoxical nature of the Celtic world. We have explored their spiritual depths and martial prowess, but what about something as simple as keeping clean? Here, the Celts hold a surprising and often unheralded title. They are widely credited with the invention of soap. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, ever the meticulous chronicler, provides our clearest account. He notes with a mixture of curiosity and disdain that the Gauls, a major Celtic confederation, made a substance from goat's tallow and beech tree ash. They used this concoction, he writes, as a kind of hair pomade, a scented unguent to give their elaborate hairstyles a stiff, dramatic hold. This seemingly simple innovation reveals a society that was not just concerned with ritual purity or battle readiness, but with personal presentation and daily comfort in a way that their Roman observers found both fascinating and utterly bizarre. The very concept of creating a dedicated cleaning agent from everyday materials points to a sophisticated understanding of basic chemistry and a desire to master the human environment, moving beyond mere survival to embrace a form of cultured living. This practical knowledge likely spread along the same trade routes that carried wine and fine pottery, another thread in the vast web of Celtic ingenuity that stretched across the continent. But the story of Celtic grooming doesn't end with a simple bar of soap. This invention was part of a much broader, and to Roman eyes, shocking aesthetic that was central to their identity. The soap itself was often just the first step in a truly dramatic process. Historical sources, including Julius Caesar's own commentaries, describe how Celtic warriors would use that soap as a base to then apply lime wash to their hair. The effect was nothing short of terrifying. The lime, a caustic substance derived from burned limestone, would literally bleach their hair, transforming it from its natural color to a stark, blazing white or a harsh yellowish blonde. More than just changing the color, the combination of the soapy pomade and the lime would cause the hair to stiffen into thick, spiky, almost horn-like projections. Imagine a battle line of warriors, their hair standing straight up or clumped into stiff, white ridges, their bodies painted with swirling blue woad patterns. The visual impact was calculated to be utterly inhuman, a deliberate distortion of the natural human form designed to provoke fear and disorientation in their enemies before the first spear was ever thrown. This was grooming as psychological warfare, a way of transforming oneself from a man into a spectral, otherworldly avenger. The Roman legionaries, with their standardized armor, short, practical haircuts, and clean-shaven faces, represented order, discipline, and civilization. The spiked, lime-washed Celt was the embodiment of chaos, a ferocious spirit of the wild made flesh. This stark contrast in appearance was a physical manifestation of the deep cultural divide between the two peoples, a clash of worldviews worn on their very bodies. This obsession with a striking appearance went far beyond the battlefield, however, speaking to a culture that placed immense value on personal adornment and status. The Celts were famous for their love of torques, those heavy, twisted metal neck rings, often made of gold, silver, or electrum, that were worn by both men and women of high rank. A torque was not merely jewelry, it was a symbol of nobility, of divine favor, and of one's place in the social hierarchy. To be seen without one in a formal setting could be a mark of shame. They also wore intricate brooches, armlets, and anklets, all finely crafted and decorated with the same elaborate knotwork and spirals that adorned their sacred objects. Even their clothing was a statement. They wore brightly colored, woven trousers, a garment the trouser-wearing Romans ironically viewed as a sign of barbarism, along with tunics and large, hooded cloaks fastened with those elaborate brooches. Every aspect of their dress, from the gleaming torque at their throat to the stiff, white spikes of their hair, was a carefully curated performance of identity. It communicated their tribe, their social standing, their wealth, and their personal bravery. In a society that valued oral tradition and public spectacle, how you looked was an integral part of who you were. Your appearance was your resume, your letter of introduction, and your psychological weapon all rolled into one. The invention of soap, therefore, was not just a footnote in the history of hygiene. It was an essential tool in the Celtic art of self-creation, a key component in the construction of a fearsome and unforgettable public persona that has resonated through the centuries, reminding us that for the Celts, even the most ordinary acts were imbued with a powerful sense of purpose and theatre. And now we venture from the solid ground of bogs and hill forts out into the treacherous, shifting waters of the Atlantic, where one of the most haunting legends of the Celtic world whispers of a glorious kingdom lost beneath the waves. This is the story of Wise, a Breton tale that has captivated generations with its potent mix of divine splendor, human folly, and apocalyptic punishment. According to the myth, Wise was the most beautiful city in the world, a marvel of engineering and opulence built by the semi-legendary King Gradlon on the coast of Brittany. To protect his magnificent creation from the ever-present threat of the ocean, Gradlon constructed an immense seawall, its gates secured by a single, massive lock. The key to this lock hung on a chain around the king's own neck, a symbol of his ultimate responsibility. But the city's downfall would not come from the sea, but from within the royal palace itself, personified by Gradlon's daughter, the beautiful and reckless Princess Dahat. Dahat was a creature of wild passions, and she established a court of unparalleled decadence, where nightly revels and forbidden pleasures became the norm. Each evening she would take a new lover from among the city's noble youths, and each morning that young man would be found dead, his body cast into the churning sea. The legend tells us that Dahat, under the influence of a demonic suitor, finally stole the key from her sleeping father's neck. Drunk with power and persuasion, she unlocked the great gates at high tide, allowing the furious ocean to come thundering into the city's streets. As the waters rose, a saint, Saint Guenelé, woke King Gradlon and urged him to flee, commanding him to cast the demonic princess who clung to his back into the raging surf. Gradlon, with a heavy heart, obeyed, and as Dahat sank beneath the waves, she was transformed into a Morgan, a malevolent sea spirit. The king alone escaped on his horse, and the city of Wise was forever swallowed by the sea, its bells said to still toll mournfully from the depths during stormy nights. This powerful narrative of a paradise lost to divine wrath feels like classic mythology, but what if the legend of Wise is more than just a moral fable? What if it preserves a distant, distorted folk memory of a real historical catastrophe? The coasts of Europe, particularly low-lying areas like the Bay of Douarnenez in Brittany, which is often cited as the location of Wise, have always been in a state of flux. We know from geological and archaeological studies that sea levels have risen significantly since the end of the last ice age, a process that continued well into the Celtic era. Entire stretches of coastline, along with the human settlements that clung to them, would have been gradually inundated or wiped out in a single, violent storm surge. The story of a city protected by a seawall is particularly telling. It suggests a community advanced enough to undertake major coastal engineering projects, a society that lived in a constant, managed struggle with the ocean. The final, catastrophic failure of that defense system would have been a traumatic, generation-defining event, the kind of disaster that becomes seared into the cultural memory of a people. The tale of Wise, passed down orally for over 1,000 years, could very well be the poetic retelling of the day the sea finally won, with the character of the sinful Princess Dahut serving as a later, Christianized explanation for a natural disaster that earlier pagan Celts would have attributed to angered sea gods. This places the legend of Wise firmly within a global tradition of flood myths, from the biblical story of Noah to the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. These stories appear in cultures worldwide, and while they are often framed as divine punishment, many scholars now see them as collective memories of very real, post-glacial sea level rise or of catastrophic regional floods, like the flooding of the Black Sea Basin. The Celtic version is unique in its specific, localized details: the seawall, the single key, the king's desperate escape, which give it a ring of authenticity that more universal flood stories lack. It speaks to a people deeply connected to and deeply vulnerable to the power of the Atlantic Ocean. The most thrilling question, of course, is what would it mean if we actually found it? The discovery of a Celtic Atlantis, the physical remains of a major, sophisticated coastal settlement like Wise, would revolutionize our understanding of their maritime capabilities. We know the Celts were skilled shipbuilders. The Romans described their sturdy, ocean-going vessels with leather sails, capable of navigating the challenging waters of the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay. But a sunken city would imply a level of coastal urban planning and centralized maritime power that we have only been able to guess at. It would reveal their harbor engineering, the scale of their sea trade networks, and perhaps even provide evidence of the complex social hierarchies needed to govern such a vulnerable but prosperous port. Underwater archaeology in the bay has, in fact, revealed submerged forests and potential human-made structures, though nothing definitively on the scale of the legendary Wise has yet been confirmed. Finding it would be like discovering a missing chapter in the Celtic story, one that shifts our perspective from their inland hill forts and river settlements to a bold, seafaring civilization that looked outward, mastering the waves until the very day the waves mastered them. The legend of Wise, therefore, stands as a poignant bridge between myth and history, a ghostly echo on the wind that may someday lead us to the silent, sunken halls of a lost Celtic world. Yet for all their grand myths and epic histories, one of the most enduring and subtly pervasive Celtic secrets is one we engage with every single day, woven into the very words we speak. It's a common belief that when the Anglo-Saxon tribes invaded Britain, they completely wiped the linguistic slate clean, pushing the native Celtic Britons to the western fringes in Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany. And it's true that Old English, the ancestor of our modern tongue, is a Germanic language through and through, with its core vocabulary of words like house, mother, bread, and water all coming from Anglo-Saxon roots. But the story of language is never that simple. The Celtic peoples and their languages were not erased. They left a profound, hidden watermark on the landscape of Britain, one that whispers to us from the names of its most ancient places. Take a map of England and you are essentially reading a Celtic dictionary. The great capital itself, London, derives from a Celtic name, likely Londinian, meaning place of the bold one. The river that flows through it, the Thames, comes from the Celtic Thameses, meaning dark one. And the name Avon, so common for rivers across England, is simply the Celtic word for river, Afon. Think about that for a moment. the Anglo-Saxons came, saw these rivers, and asked the local Britons what they were called. The answer was river. And so, on maps today, we have the River Avon, which literally translates to river. This pattern repeats everywhere, from the downs and combes describing hills and valleys to the names of ancient forests and towns. These place names are the stubborn, unyielding ghosts of the Celtic world, permanent fixtures in the landscape that refuse to be silenced, proving that the first people never truly left. They just imprinted their identity onto the hills and streams, leaving a permanent record for those who know how to listen. But the hidden linguistic influence runs far deeper than mere geography, into the very engine room of English grammar. Here we find one of the most fascinating puzzles in linguistics, the peculiar way modern English forms questions and negative statements. Consider a simple question like, do you like history? In almost every other Germanic language, German, Dutch, Swedish, this structure is unnecessary. A German speaker would simply say, magst du Geschichte, by inverting the verb and the subject. The English method, using the auxiliary verb do as a dummy operator, is utterly unique among its linguistic cousins. So where did it come from? The compelling theory points directly to the language of the subjugated Celtic population. When the Anglo-Saxons established their political dominance, they did not exterminate the native Britons. Instead, a vast population of Celtic speakers lived on, now forced to learn the new Germanic tongue of their rulers as a second language. In this situation of intense language contact, what linguists call a substratum, something remarkable happens. The learners often import the grammatical habits of their native tongue into the new language. While their vocabulary shifts, the underlying subconscious structures of their original grammar can persist. Scholars propose that the Celtic languages, like early Welsh, had a syntax that relied heavily on periphrastic constructions using auxiliary verbs to convey tense, mood, and emphasis. The Celtic Britons, learning Old English, may have instinctively applied this familiar grammatical blueprint, overusing verbs like do to form questions and negatives in a way that felt natural to them. Over generations, as the two populations mixed, this Celtic style of speaking English became increasingly common, eventually solidifying into the standard grammar we use today. It was a silent rebellion of syntax, a grammatical ghost in the machine that outlasted the conquest. This theory gains even more weight when we look at other unique features of English that set it apart from its Germanic relatives. Another signature trait is the use of the present continuous tense, as in I am reading, rather than the simple present, I read, to describe an action happening right now. This precise structure is also a hallmark of Celtic languages. Furthermore, the rich system of verb-noun constructions in English, like I went shopping or I love swimming, finds a direct parallel in Celtic grammar. These are not superficial vocabulary borrowings. They are deep-seated structural fingerprints, evidence of a foundational Celtic layer beneath the Germanic surface of English. It's as if the Anglo-Saxons provided the bricks and mortar of the language, the core words, but the Celtic Britons provided the underlying architectural blueprint, the subconscious grammar that organized those words in a uniquely British way. This reveals a much more complex and integrated history than the old story of outright replacement. It shows us that culture is not a simple matter of conquest and obliteration, but a slow, subtle process of absorption and synthesis. The Celtic identity was not erased. It went underground, shaping the very rhythm and structure of the language of its conquerors from the inside out. So, every time you ask a friend, do you want to go for a walk? You are unconsciously participating in a linguistic tradition over 2,000 years old, echoing the grammatical patterns of the ancient Britons, and proving that the most powerful legacies are often the ones spoken in silence, built into the code of our most everyday conversations. But who were the original inhabitants of this misty island before the arrival of the Celtic gods? Irish mythology provides a chilling answer in the form of the Fomorians, a terrifying race of monstrous beings who embody the raw, untamed chaos of the primal world. Described as grotesque and misshapen, the Fomorians were often depicted with a single arm, a single leg, or the heads of goats and bulls. They were not merely giants, they were incarnations of the storm, the blight, and the crushing power of the sea. Their very name is thought to derive from words meaning undersea or underworld, painting them as chthonic forces rising from the deep to challenge the order of the land. They were the ancient, established power in Ireland when the next wave of divine settlers, the Tuatha Dé Danann, arrived. The epic battles between these two forces, most notably the two battles of Mog Tuairad, form the core of Ireland's mythological cycle, and they are far more than simple stories of good versus evil. The Fomorians were not pure villains, they were a necessary, if terrifying, part of the cosmic balance. They represented the harsh, unforgiving realities of nature that any new culture must confront and ultimately learn to placate or control in order to survive. The great Fomorian king, Balor of the Evil Eye, perfectly symbolizes this dual nature. His eye, which was so malevolent it could destroy an entire army when opened, was kept shut by 7 leather straps and was only uncovered in battle. He is a figure of cataclysmic power, a force of nature like a volcano or a hurricane, dormant and manageable for a time, but capable of utter devastation when unleashed. This mythological dynamic of a new, ordering people conquering an ancient, chaotic race is a recurring theme across world folklore, and it often holds a hidden key to understanding real prehistoric events. When we listen closely to these myths, we begin to hear the distant echoes of a much older story, one written not in parchment but in the movement of peoples and the clash of cultures across millennia. The narrative of the Tuatha Dé Danann defeating the Fomorians can be interpreted as a powerful allegory for the arrival of Celtic-speaking peoples into Ireland and their complex interactions with the pre-existing inhabitants. Archaeology tells us that Ireland was not an empty land. For thousands of years before the Celts, it was home to Neolithic farmers and Bronze Age metalworkers, the people who built the great passage tombs like Newgrange. These indigenous populations had their own traditions, their own gods, and their own deep connection to the land. The coming of the Celts with their Iron Age technology, their sophisticated social structures, and their own powerful pantheon would have been a world-shattering event. The mythological conquest was likely not a single genocidal war, but a long, slow process of cultural dominance, conflict, and eventual assimilation. The Fomorians, with their monstrous appearance and association with the wild, untamed parts of the island, the storm-lashed coasts and the barren mountains, may well be the mythological memory of these earlier peoples, distorted through the lens of the newcomer's perspective. To the incoming Celts, the indigenous inhabitants might have seemed primitive, strange, and deeply connected to the more fearsome aspects of the natural world that the Celts themselves were trying to master. Their different languages, customs, and rituals would have marked them as other, and over generations of storytelling, this otherness could easily have been magnified into the monstrous forms of the Fomorians. Yet, the mythology refuses to paint a simple picture of pure replacement. The most compelling evidence for a historical reality of integration lies in the intricate web of marriages and alliances that entwine the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians. The most famous example is the union of the Tuatha Dé Danann king Nuada with the Fomorian princess Ethniu, who was the daughter of the dreaded Balor himself. From this union was born Lug Lamfodda, Lug of the Long Arm, one of the greatest and most celebrated gods in the entire Celtic pantheon. This is a profound narrative detail. The greatest hero of the new people is literally the grandson of the most monstrous king of the old people. This suggests that the eventual Celtic culture of Ireland did not see itself as purely Celtic, but as a synthesis, a blending of the incoming and the indigenous. The hero possesses the strength and order of his father's people, but he also carries within him the potent primal power of his mother's lineage. He is the product of both worlds, and his success is dependent on this very combination. This mythological theme mirrors what we know from archaeology and genetics, which shows continuity rather than complete replacement. The old gods and spirits of the land were rarely erased. They were often absorbed, transformed, and given new names and stories within the conquering culture's framework. The Fomorians, in this light, were not utterly vanquished. Their essence, their connection to the raw power of the land, was incorporated into the new order, becoming a foundational, if shadowy, part of the Irish identity. They became the necessary darkness against which the light of civilization was defined, the ancient bedrock upon which the new kingdom was built. The myth of their defeat is paradoxically the story of their eternal presence, a hidden lineage of power that flows through the very veins of the land and its people, a permanent reminder that every new beginning must first come to terms with the deep, ancient forces that preceded it. Now we confront a secret that lies at the very edge of history and consciousness, a practice that may have served as the ultimate bridge between the earthly and the divine. Throughout our journey, we've seen the Celts seek visions through sacred sites and ecstatic rituals, but what if they possessed a more direct chemical key to unlock the doors of perception? Mounting evidence suggests that the Druids, those master botanists and spiritual guides, were not just symbolically communing with nature. They may have been skilled psychonauts, deliberately using psychoactive plants to induce altered states and peer into the very fabric of the cosmos. This isn't a modern fantasy. It's a theory grounded in a re-examination of classical texts, archaeological finds, and the potent flora native to the Celtic world. Consider the iconic image of the Druid, clad in white, using a golden sickle to harvest mistletoe from a sacred oak. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder describes this ritual with awe, noting that the plant was believed to hold the soul of the tree itself. For centuries, this was viewed as pure symbolism, but a closer look at the pharmacology of mistletoe, specifically the European variety Viscum album, reveals a startling possibility. While highly toxic in large doses, certain preparations of mistletoe contain compounds that can induce altered states of consciousness, characterized by vivid visual and auditory hallucinations, a sense of euphoria, and out-of-body experiences. The golden sickle, far from being merely ceremonial, might have been a practical tool to prevent the potent sap from being contaminated by iron, preserving the plant's psychoactive properties for a carefully controlled ritual brew. Beyond the sacred mistletoe, the Celtic landscape offered a veritable pharmacy for the initiated. The fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, with its distinctive red cap and white spots, grows in the birch and pine forests of northern Europe. Its primary psychoactive compounds, muscimol and ibotenic acid, are known to produce powerful dissociative and visionary states, along with sensations of superhuman strength and size distortion experiences that align perfectly with mythological descriptions of heroes transforming into giants or communing with towering gods. Then there is henbane, a plant of the nightshade family, whose seeds have been found in Celtic ritual pits and burial sites across Europe. Henbane contains potent tropane alkaloids like scopolamine and hyoscyamine, which can cause intense delirium, vivid dreams, and a complete break from reality. The use of such a powerful and dangerous plant would have required exacting knowledge. A slight miscalculation in dosage could lead to permanent psychosis or death. This points to a sophisticated, guarded tradition of herbal lore, where the Druids acted as the ultimate gatekeepers, administering these substances within a strict ritual framework to ensure the experience served a spiritual purpose rather than descending into chaotic frenzy. The question then becomes, what was the purpose of these potentially deadly journeys? The most compelling answer lies in the pursuit of prophecy and divine communication. In a state of profound psychedelic trance, a Druid might believe they were traveling to the other world, able to speak directly with ancestors or gods and return with messages vital to the tribe's survival. This could explain the source of their famed oracular powers, the ability to predict the outcome of a battle, the arrival of a plague, or the success of a harvest. The visions induced by these plants, with their swirling patterns, entities, and symbolic narratives, would have been interpreted as literal divine broadcasts, providing a tangible, experiential foundation for their spiritual authority. Furthermore, these substances likely played a crucial role in the initiation of elite warriors and new druids. The heroic feats described in the Ulster cycle, where warriors like Cu Chulainn experience Ryostrad or battle frenzy, distorting their bodies and unleashing uncontrollable rage, bear a striking resemblance to the reported effects of certain psychoactive compounds. An initiation ritual involving a controlled, terrifying journey into the depths of one's own psyche could have been the final test of courage and mental fortitude, a symbolic death and rebirth that forged a young man into a warrior or a student into a master of esoteric knowledge. By willingly facing the inner chaos and terror these plants could unleash, the initiate would prove their readiness to confront any external threat. This practice of sacred intoxication also provides a fascinating new lens through which to view some of the most enigmatic Celtic artifacts. The Gundestrup cauldron, with its panel showing a figure dipping a man into a barrel, could be depicting a ritual of psychedelic initiation rather than a simple drowning. The swirling, intricate patterns of Celtic knotwork, so hypnotic and complex, may be artistic representations of the entoptic phenomena, the geometric visual patterns commonly seen in the early stages of a psychedelic trance. The artists could have been transcribing the very architecture of the spirit world as revealed to them in their visions, making the sacred geometry of the mind permanently visible on metal and stone. When we consider this hidden dimension of their practice, the Celtic world transforms yet again. They were not just stargazers and warriors, they were explorers of inner space, pioneers of consciousness who believed that the ultimate truths were not found in scrolls, but in the direct, unmediated, and chemically facilitated experience of the divine. Their greatest secret may have been the understanding that the gateway to the gods was not only in the stones of Newgrange or the depths of the bog, but within the human mind itself, waiting to be unlocked by the key of a sacred plant. And now we come to one of the most visually arresting and intellectually puzzling secrets of the entire Celtic world, one that stares down from the stonework of medieval churches with a bold, unnerving, and undeniable presence. Perched on castle walls, tucked above doorways, and carved into the corbels of holy sites across Ireland, Britain, and even parts of continental Europe, are the Síle na gCig. These are stone carvings of naked female figures in a stark, almost abstract style, their most prominent and exaggerated feature being a deliberately displayed and often massively enlarged vulva, which they hold open with their own hands. To the modern eye, these images can seem shockingly out of place on a Christian church, a jarring contradiction to the modest, pious figures we expect to find in such settings. This very contradiction is the heart of their secret. While they appear on buildings from the 12th century onward, the overwhelming consensus among scholars is that their origin is not Christian at all, but reaches back into the deep, pre-Christian past of the Celtic world. They are pagan goddesses in holy drag, a stubborn, stone-born testament to the fact that when new beliefs sweep across a land, the old gods do not simply vanish. They go underground, or in this case, they climb the walls, finding a new home and a new context in the very architecture of the faith that sought to replace them. So, what was their true purpose and why were they tolerated and even prominently displayed on Christian buildings? The debate is as lively as the carvings themselves, and it revolves around three compelling and often overlapping theories. The first and most traditional interpretation, often favored by the church itself in later centuries, was that the Síle na gCig were crude warnings against the sin of lust. In this view, they were medieval memento mori, designed to shock the viewer, particularly women, into chastity by presenting the female body not as an object of desire, but as a grotesque and sinful reminder of the flesh's corruptibility. Their often aged, gaunt, and sometimes skeletal features were seen as emphasizing the vanity of worldly beauty and the ultimate decay of the physical form. Yet, this theory begins to unravel when you consider the context. If the goal was to discourage lust, placing these explicit images directly above the main doorway of a church, the very portal through which the community entered to seek grace, seems a counterintuitive strategy, almost guaranteeing that parishioners would be confronted by the very thing they were supposed to avoid. This has led many to believe that the warning interpretation was a later Christian reframing of a symbol whose original power was something entirely different and far more potent. This brings us to the second and perhaps most widely accepted theory, that the Sheela na gig was a powerful apotropaic symbol, a magical device intended to ward off evil. In this light, her explicit display was not an invitation to sin, but a potent form of spiritual warfare. The concept of using images of genitalia, childbirth, and sexuality to avert evil is an ancient and global practice. The ancient Romans used phallic symbols called fascinum to protect homes and children from the evil eye, and similar female figures, known as barbo, were used in the Greco-Roman world to scare away malevolent forces. The logic behind this is rooted in a primal understanding of magic and psychology. The sight of the female genitals, particularly in such an exaggerated and confrontational manner, was believed to be so shocking, so overpowering, that it could literally petrify and confuse evil spirits. Just as a complex Celtic knot might trap a demon in its endless loops, the raw, chaotic power of birth and creation represented by the Sheela was thought to be so immense that it could overwhelm and drive away any malign entity approaching the sacred space. She was the ultimate spiritual guard dog, using the most fundamental force of life itself to protect the community from death and decay. Her placement over doorways and windows, the vulnerable points of any building, makes perfect sense in this context. She was not there to lecture the faithful, but to stand sentinel, using her ancient pagan power to protect the new Christian congregation within. But to stop at the idea of a simple protective charm is to miss the deepest layer of this secret. Many researchers now argue that the Sheela na gig is the direct, stone-carved descendant of a powerful Celtic sovereignty or mother goddess, a crone figure who held dominion over life, death, and regeneration. Look beyond the explicit gesture, and you often see a figure that is not young and nubile, but old with prominent ribs, a skeletal frame, and sagging breasts. This is not a goddess of fertility in the simple sense of birthing children. This is a goddess who encompasses the entire cycle of existence. She is the Cailleach, the primordial hag of Irish and Scottish mythology, who could shape mountains with her hammer and control the very weather with her breath. She is the Morrigan, the phantom queen who presides over battle and fate. This ancient goddess figure was both creator and destroyer. She gave life and she took it away, and her body was the gateway for both. Her exaggerated vulva is not merely a sexual symbol, but the representation of the portal between worlds, the place from which all life emerges and to which it returns in death. By displaying it so boldly, the Sheela na gig invokes the entire, terrifying, and awesome cycle of creation and dissolution. She is a reminder that the source of life is also intimately connected with its end, and that this power is ultimately feminine, ancient, and utterly sovereign. The fact that these figures were carved onto Christian churches is one of history's most brilliant acts of cultural synthesis. When missionaries sought to convert the Celtic peoples, they encountered a spiritual worldview deeply tied to the land and its powerful female deities. Simply banning these beliefs was often less effective than absorbing and redefining them. The Church, in its pragmatic wisdom, likely allowed or even commissioned the carving of Sheela na gigs as a way to ease the transition to Christianity. They provided a familiar, potent symbol of protection that the local population understood and trusted, a bridge between the old world and the new. The pagan goddess in her Sheila form was given a job in the new order to protect the church. In doing so, the church successfully channeled the deep, pre-Christian reverence for the divine feminine into a structure it could control, but it could never entirely strip the Sheila of her original power. She remains there to this day, a stark stone paradox, a pagan crone goddess forever frozen in the act of guarding a Christian temple, her secret echoing through the centuries that the oldest powers of the earth of birth, death, and protection are never truly conquered, only transformed. But the most extraordinary chapter of the Celtic diaspora unfolded not in the familiar lands of the West, but in the very heart of the classical world's most feared enemy. This is the story of the Galatians, a living piece of Celtic civilization transplanted over 1,000 miles from its homeland, deep into the highlands of Anatolia in what is now modern Turkey. It began in the chaos of the early 3rd century before the Common Era, when a massive confederation of Celtic tribes, whom the Greeks called the Galatai, surged into the Balkans. Their reputation as fearsome mercenaries preceded them, and they were hired by various Hellenistic kingdoms to fight in their internecine wars. But this migrating horde, including the Tectosiges, Trochmai, and Tolostobogi tribes, soon became a power in their own right, a destabilizing force that even threatened the sacred oracle at Delphi. Pushed back from Greece, they were eventually invited by the king of Bithynia, a local ruler desperate for a military edge, to cross into Asia Minor as his allies. Once there, they saw the rich, undefended lands of the interior and decided to stay, carving out a territory for themselves that became known as Galatia. For over a century, they ruled this central Anatolian plateau as a dominant warrior elite, their culture standing in stark contrast to the Hellenistic cities that surrounded them. They established their own fortified strongholds like Ancyra, which would later become Turkey's capital, Ankara. They spoke their native Gallic language, which St. Jerome noted was still similar to that spoken in Gaul centuries later. They governed themselves in a tribal structure led by chieftains and a council of elders, and they practiced their traditional Druidic religion, their presence a jarring and enduring anomaly in the East. The collision of these two worlds, Celtic and Greek, was dramatic. The settled, urban populations of the coast viewed the Galatians with a mixture of terror and fascination. They were the archetypal barbarians, fierce and unpredictable. Greek sculptors immortalized this fear in some of the most poignant art of the period, such as the Dying Gaul, a statue that depicts a wounded Celtic warrior with his distinctive torque, spiky hair, and a profound, noble pathos. Yet, over generations, an inevitable process of cultural fusion began. The Galatians, while fiercely holding onto their core identity, started to adopt elements of the more complex society around them. They began minting coins with Greek inscriptions alongside their own symbols. Their chieftains started to use Greek titles and interact with the intricate diplomatic networks of the Hellenistic kingdoms. They slowly became Hellenized, but they never ceased to be seen as Celts, a distinct ethnic group within the Roman Empire long after their territory was peacefully incorporated. Their most famous appearance in the historical record comes from the Christian New Testament in St. Paul's letter to the Galatians. This epistle, written to the early Christian communities in the region, is addressed directly to these Celtic descendants, proving that their unique identity was recognized throughout the Roman world. They were a people caught between two worlds, a living bridge between the barbarian north and the civilized east, their very existence proving the astonishing geographic reach of the Celtic peoples. This final secret forces a complete re-evaluation of the Celtic story. They did not simply fade away after their conquest by Rome or their displacement by Germanic tribes. The narrative of a people being pushed to the Atlantic fringe, to Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany is only half the story. The other half is one of integration and dissemination. Their bloodlines and traditions were not erased. They were woven thread by thread into the very fabric of Europe. This legacy is most visible in the vibrant Celtic nations that persist today, where languages like Welsh, Irish Gaelic, and Breton are spoken, and ancient cultural traditions are celebrated. But the hidden legacy runs much deeper, embedded in the genetic makeup of millions of people across the continent. Genetic studies have repeatedly shown a strong genetic continuity in regions like Atlantic Europe, suggesting that the Celtic-speaking peoples who arrived thousands of years ago formed a significant portion of the ancestral population that still lives there today. The story is not one of population replacement, but of cultural and linguistic transformation layered over a persistent genetic substrate. The Anglo-Saxons may have brought their language to England, but they did not replace the underlying Celtic population. They merged with it. The same is true across France, Spain, and Portugal, where the deep genetic roots of the population still reflect the prehistoric movements of Celtic and pre-Celtic peoples. The ultimate hidden secret of the Celts, then, is that they never truly vanished. They are not a lost civilization waiting to be found in a forgotten ruin, but a living, breathing part of our modern world. Their story is one of resilience and adaptation, not extinction. Their artistic genius echoes in the knotwork of a tattoo or the design of a piece of jewelry. Their linguistic ghost whispers from the rivers Avon and the hills of the Downs. Their spiritual worldview, with its reverence for nature and belief in an otherworld, continues to resonate in our collective imagination and in the modern pagan traditions that seek to reconnect with the old ways. Their fearless spirit lives on in the cultural identities of the nations that proudly claim a Celtic heritage. The blue-painted warrior facing the Roman legion is an iconic image, but it is a snapshot of a single moment in a much longer, richer, and more complex story. The true legacy of the Celts is not a single artifact or a decisive battle. It is the profound and enduring mark they left on the language, the land, and the very people of Europe. They were not a fleeting moment in history, but a fundamental ingredient in the recipe of the modern West. A brilliant and enigmatic people whose secrets are not buried in the ground, but are alive all around us, waiting only for us to recognize them. Our journey through these 25 hidden secrets draws to a close, but the portrait they leave us with is one of stunning complexity and profound revision. We began by looking past the Roman caricature of the blue-painted savage and discovered a civilization of brilliant astronomers who encoded celestial cycles into the very landscape at Newgrange and Carnac. We met master engineers whose oak roads conquered treacherous bogs and whose revolutionary chainmail was so effective their enemies adopted it. We uncovered a society where women could be warriors, rulers, and druids, enjoying rights that would have been unthinkable in Rome or Athens. We saw their deep spirituality, a worldview where the soul resided in the head, where the other world was a tangible reality, and where communion with the divine might have been sought through sacred plants and ecstatic trances. From the mathematical precision of the Coligny Calendar to the intricate, symbolic language of their knotwork, from the global trade networks that brought them Greek wine to the distant diaspora that planted a Celtic kingdom in the heart of Turkey, every secret we've uncovered challenges the simplistic narrative. The Celts were not a monolith of chaos. They were innovators, spiritual seekers, artists, and lawmakers. They were a people who saw the entire cosmos as interconnected, a web of life where the spiritual and material worlds were in constant dialogue, and where human creativity was a force to be channeled into everything from terrifying weapons to breathtaking silver cauldrons. The most shocking revelation is perhaps the sheer breadth of their genius, a sophistication in science, art, and social structure that rivaled any of their so-called civilized contemporaries. They were not a people history forgot. They are a people whose story was deliberately overwritten, and we are only now, piece by piece, reclaiming their true legacy from the shadows. This exploration is far from over. Every new archaeological find, every fresh interpretation of a myth, has the power to further reshape our understanding. And that's where you come in. We've traveled through 25 secrets, but which one reshaped your view of the ancient world the most? Was it the discovery of the warrior women buried with their chariots and swords? The haunting mystery of the bog bodies and their ritualized deaths, or the mind-bending engineering of Newgrange's solstice light? Let us know in the comments below which secret captivated you and why. And if you're ready to continue peeling back the layers of history's greatest mysteries with us, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the forgotten past.